Hey everyone, this is Shruti from Simplilearn. Welcome to this video tutorial on CISSP Training. In this training, we will be focusing on the world-renowned certification, Certified Information Systems Security Professional, more often called CISSP. For all those CISSP aspirants out there, this video will brief you with CISSP. Here we will learn the importance of having a CISSP certification, what exactly CISSP is all about, CISSP exam requirements, and the various domains in CISSP. We will also have an overview of the CISSP exam along with a few sample questions. For this training, with me, I have our experienced cybersecurity specialist, Bipin, and together we will take you through the various topics in CISSP, all of this in under 3 hours. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell icon to never miss an update from Simplilearn. So let's start off this tutorial by understanding the need for the CISSP certification. You would be aware of the various cybersecurity certifications like CCNA, CompTIA Security Plus, CISM, CISA, and CEH to name a few. You might have also come across the CISSP certification. Let me tell you, this is one of the toughest and most in-demand certification in the cybersecurity field. In the current times, managing information security in a company can be extremely challenging. With the advent of the internet and various other technologies, there is a large exposure to various security breaches. The presence of information security experts in-house helps organizations manage their IT processes in a better way. This is where a CISSP professional is in demand by employers. Compared to the other cybersecurity professionals, the demand for CISSP certified professionals has grown rapidly. There are nearly 50,000 job postings for the same. Now that you have an idea of the demand of CISSP certified professionals, let's move on to understanding what exactly is CISSP. CISSP stands for Certified Information Systems Security Professional. It is considered the gold standard in the field of information security. This certification is taken up by IT professionals. It trains a candidate to become an information assurance professional. Taking up the CISSP certification will help you define the design, architecture, controls, and management of highly secure business environments. You will also be called a CISSP professional only after you successfully pass the CISSP exam. So now let's have a look into the CISSP exam requirements. The primary requirement for any candidate is that they should have at least 5 years of work experience in the field of information security. In addition to this, it is also suggested that the candidate clears other certifications like CCNA, CompTIA Security Plus, CEH, CISM, and CISA to name a few. CISSP is considered as an advanced level cybersecurity certification. Hence, it is better if the candidate clears the basic level and the managerial level certifications before moving to the CISSP certification. As I mentioned earlier, this certification is suitable for professionals who have a minimum of 5 years of work experience. Professionals working as security consultants and managers, network and security architects, IT directors, security auditors, and chief information security officers can take up the CISSP certification. Let's now move on to our next topic, that is CISSP Domains. This entire certification is grouped into a total of 8 domains. The broad spectrum of topics included in CISSP ensure its relevance across all disciplines in the field of information security. Successful candidates are competent in the following 8 domains. They are security and risk management, then we have asset security, security engineering, communications and network security, followed by identity and access management, then security assessment and testing, security operations, and finally we have software development security. These 8 domains deal with different aspects of information security. We will have a look into each of these individually and understand what each of these domains symbolize. First up, we have the security and risk management domain. As the name suggests, this domain mainly consists of the fundamentals of security policies, compliance law and regulations, professional ethics, risk management, and threat modeling. Cybersecurity and information security plays a major role in this domain. There is a difference between cybersecurity and information security which is more often missed out on by people. Cybersecurity refers to several techniques used to protect the integrity of networks, whereas information security refers to processes and tools deployed to protect sensitive information. To implement cybersecurity, we have a list of approaches like compliance-based, ad hoc, and risk-based. In compliance-based, security measures are decided based on regulations, while in ad hoc, security measures are based on no specific criteria. In risk-based, security measures are based on unique risks depending on the organization. Let's now have a look at the CIA triad. Here, C stands for confidentiality, I for integrity, and A for availability. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability have served as the industry standard for computer security since the time of the first mainframes. Confidentiality means that information and functions can be accessed only by authorized parties, for example, military secrets. Integrity means that information and functions can be added, altered, or removed only by authorized people. And availability means that systems, functions, and data must be available on demand. Now that we have understood the CIA triad, let's have a look at the GRC trilogy. This trilogy is a structured approach adopted by organizations to align IT objectives with business objectives. First up, we have governance. Such a program has motives like ensuring goals are achieved, providing strategic plans, and so on. Governance is taken care of by the senior professionals of an organization. Next up, we have risk management. Here, the organization looks into mitigating all types of risks such as investment, physical, and cyber risks. Finally, we have compliance. As discussed previously, compliance refers to abiding by the defined laws and regulations. So who do you all think develops a security policy which is used to achieve the organization's goals? Well, it is done by the senior management of an organization. Let's have a look at the characteristics of these security policies. First and foremost, these policies should support the vision and mission of the company. All the business units should be integrated in these security policies. They should also be regularly updated. And finally, it is important that these security policies should be easy to understand so that everyone can abide by them without any problem. In addition to security policies, a risk analysis team is also formed in organization to perform the analysis of each known risk. There are various steps to perform risk analysis. Let's have a look at each of these. First, the team makes an assessment of the value of the company's assets. Then, there is an analysis made based on the risks to assets. And finally, the team discovers solutions to mitigate these risks. Now, that was all about the first domain of CISSP, security and risk management. Let's have a look at the second domain, asset security. Asset security deals with the collection and protection of assets such as data and devices. Here, we will be looking into data classification, data management, data remnants, and data loss prevention. So in data classification, the data owner classifies data. A data owner can be an individual or a group of people who created the information and are directly responsible for it. This classification is done based on a set of predefined criteria. At the end, the classification is annually reviewed to see if there has to be some change incorporated. Data management involves managing the information lifecycle needs of an enterprise in an effective manner. It also ensures that the data complies to the set standards. And finally, data management also ensures data validity and integrity. Moving on to data remnants. It is a term used for the residual of digital data that is present even after trying to erase the data. Data remnants should be avoided as data should be completely destroyed. To tackle data remnants, we have methods like overwriting and destruction to name a few. In overwriting, other information is written over the data several times so that the original data cannot be recovered. In destruction, data in the storage device is physically damaged to make recovery difficult. Asset security also looks into data loss prevention. Here, several measures and risk assessments are performed to ensure that information is only available to authorized users. Let's now move on to our third domain, security engineering. As the name suggests, this domain talks about security architecture, security models, cryptography, and physical security. Security architecture establishes a common practice for creating, analyzing, and using architecture description within a particular domain. Security architecture takes the help of TCB, that is Trusted Computing Base, security perimeter, and reference models to implement security. Cryptography is also a part of security engineering. In cryptography, information is secured by converting data from a readable format to a non-readable format and vice versa. Moving to our fourth domain, we have communications and network security. This domain is all about network structures, transmission methods, and security measures used to achieve CIA in an organization. OSI model is the foundation of networking. This model, that is the Open Systems Interconnection Model, OSI model, describes how data is transferred from one computer to another. The OSI model consists of 7 layers, starting from physical layer, then data link layer, network layer, transport layer, session layer, presentation layer, and finally application layer. In the first layer, that is, physical layer transmits raw bit stream over the physical medium. Then data link layer defines the format of data on the network. Network layer provides logical addressing, and it also provides path determination using local addressing. The fourth layer, that is transport layer, provides end-to-end connections. In this layer, data is transmitted using transmission protocols including TCP and UDP. The session layer maintains connections, and it is also responsible for controlling ports and sessions. The sixth layer, that is the presentation layer, ensures that data is in a usable format. And finally, in the seventh layer, that is in the application layer, human-computer interaction happens. Here, applications can access the network services. The communications and network security domain also talks about firewalls. We can define a firewall as a hardware or software which is used to block the incoming or outgoing traffic from the internet to your computer. Then we also have the IDS. IDS is known as the Intrusion Detection System. This is designed to detect unauthorized access to a system. IDS is used together with the firewall and a router. Moving to identity and access management, our fifth domain, let's have a look at what this domain is all about. This domain of CISSP is all about the access control, identification, authorization, and attacks on access control and its countermeasures. To be able to access a dataset or a resource, a subject has to be identified, authenticated, and authorized. Identity management, Kerberos, and access criteria are few of the crucial fields here. In identity management, through automated means, users are identified and authenticated. This domain also speaks of Kerberos, an authentication protocol that is based on symmetric key cryptography and provides end-to-end security. Access to data shouldn't be granted to anyone and everyone. In fact, it should be granted based on the level of trust and the job role in the organization. It is also better if it is provided based on the location and the time. Let's now have a look at our sixth domain, security assessment and testing. So in this domain, we will look into audits, security control assessment, and testing reports. As you might have heard of the term audit, it is nothing but a repeated process wherein an independent professional evaluates and analyzes evidence. Then we have vulnerability assessment, wherein IT risks are identified and evaluated. It helps in identifying, quantifying, and prioritizing vulnerabilities. A well-planned and executed assessment and test strategy can provide valuable information about risk and risk mitigation. The assessment and test is executed by a working group called the Integrated Product Team. Testing is performed to check the data flow between the application and the system. Up next, we have the security operations domain. The seventh domain of CISSP is all about investigations, monitoring and logging, disaster recovery, and change management. Here, we will look into the fields of digital forensics, incident management, and perimeter security. Investigation of a computer crime is also known as computer forensics. In digital forensics, data is examined to identify, recover, and analyze opinions about digital information. Incident management works to restore the services to normal as soon as possible. A team called the Incident Response Team is deployed to handle such emergencies. Incident response is defined as a practice of detecting a problem, determining its cause, minimizing the damage, resolving the problem, and documenting each step. This team provides management with sufficient information and defends the company against future attacks. In perimeter security, there is perimeter defense, which allows us to detect and keep a check on unauthorized physical access. This field also controls the access to the facility. Moving on to our eighth and final domain, we have software development security. As the name suggests, this domain talks about security in a software development lifecycle. Here, we will be looking into topics like API, malware, spyware, adware, social engineering attacks, and SQL injection attack. Let's start off with the application program interface known as API. API is basically a collection of protocols and functions used to create applications. It supports formats such as representational state transfer REST and simple object access protocol. REST is nothing but using the present features of the web in a simple way. And SOAP, which is an acronym for Simple Object Access Protocol, is a messaging protocol for exchanging data among computers. Now let's move on to malware as a security threat. Malware is a term which refers to malicious software, viruses, ransomware, and worms. We can also call Trojan virus as a form of malware which is capable of disguising itself as a legitimate software. Malware is basically a broad term that refers to a variety of malicious programs. One way to protect your software from malware is to always double-check your downloads. Moving on to our next security threat, spyware. As the name suggests, this is a software that typically spies on your system. Spyware is also a type of malware which is used to secretly gather information of the victim to give it to a third party. Those programs that secretly record all that you do on your computer are called spyware. It is always advised to turn on pop-up blockers to prevent spyware. Next up, we have adware. Adware is also known as advertising supported software. It is a type of malware that constantly displays ads and pop-ups. Some of such ads can also gather your information. At times, adware is not all that dangerous, but it is a hassle as it is a gateway to unwanted advertising on the screen, and it can also change the browser homepage. Adwares are known to display unwanted, annoying advertisements on your screens. Let's now have a look at social engineering attacks. It is basically the art of manipulating people so that they end up giving their confidential information. This attack lures victims into handing over their confidential data. This attack takes place by tricking the human mind. The most common social engineering attacks are phishing, spear phishing, and mailing phishing attack. Phishing attack is a practice wherein the hacker usually sends fraudulent emails which appear to be coming from a very trusted source. This is done to install malware or to steal sensitive data like credit card information and various other login credentials. Spear phishing attack is a variation of phishing. Here, the attacker targets a specific individual or a group of people. And in whaling phishing attack, wealthy, powerful, and prominent individuals are made targets. Moving on to our next attack, we have SQL injection attack. SQL injection attack is a type of code injection attack. In a database-driven website, the hacker manipulates a standard SQL query. It allows attackers to tamper with the existing data. Here, malicious code is inserted into the SQL server to obtain information.
So, in CISSP, as with every security course, we start off with the CIA triad. Now here CIA is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So it starts off with every security mechanism. When we talk about security and we want to keep things secure, what is it that we want to secure? It is the data of an organization that is the most valuable asset to the organization, and that's what we want to secure. When we say that we want the data to be secured, we basically talk about three aspects for that data. The first and the foremost, that the data needs to remain confidential. The second aspect, that the data needs to be trustworthy. And the third concept, that the data should be available to all authorized users when and where they require it. So going back to the first point, when we say we want data to be confidential, what do we mean by that? By confidentiality, we talk about that data being made available only to authorized users after you have authenticated them, ensured or assured of their authenticity, and only then you're going to give access to that data, right? So even if you go into an organization has a hierarchy of governance, right? So only certain people with certain clearances or certain job titles can have access to certain amount of data, whereas other people may not have access to it. For example, a person working in the sales department will not have access to data that is accessed by the HR department. Thus, that's what we are looking at: classification of data and keeping it confidential, only making it available to those people who require it. When we say trustworthiness or the integrity of that data, the integrity is where the data has been altered, modified, removed, deleted by unauthorized people. So we want to prevent that, which means when we say we want the integrity intact, we want to ensure that only authorized people can modify, alter, or remove data if they are allowed to do so. So that's where the authorization and authentication comes into the picture again. And data needs to be available. For me to safeguard data, I can just lock it up in a safe, throw the safe in the depth of an ocean, and say that the data is secure because it cannot be leaked out. But that data is no longer available to authorized users, hence that data is useless. For me, data would have value when the data remains confidential, has its trustworthiness intact, and is still available to all the users that are authorized to access it. So when we talk about security, we want these three aspects to be implemented on any and every digital asset that the organization has, and thus, once these 3 points are guaranteed or at least assured to a certain extent, we can then say that the data or that particular asset is secured. Moving on, let's talk about information security. Information security is the process of protecting data and information systems. So in the CIA, as we talked about it, when we said what do we want to protect, we want to protect all the information assets or the technical assets that we have from any of the vulnerabilities that can be identified. So we want to restrict unauthorized access and use. We want to restrict deletion, accidental or intentional, if they have not been authorized to do so, modification of data, so the integrity part, and destruction of data. Destruction could not only be deleting data, but it could be something like a ransomware where the data gets encrypted, so it's still there, it's just not accessible to you. Now, information security ensures the implementation of these following aspects. The first and foremost comes from information security policies, which is the governance aspect of it. The policies are designed to have a implementation of security in an organization that helps the business processes to be executed in a secure manner. Where are these policies coming from? They come from standards or guidelines which are globally available and based on which we can start developing our security policies. For example, if I want to develop a security policy in my organization, I might want to depend on frameworks like ISO 27001, COBIT, or something similar. Once I have these standards set, I would come back to procedures. Procedures being how are these standards to be executed, right? For example, in my policies, I ensured that I want encryption of AES 256 to be implemented, or rather in the policy, I determined that we want encryption to be implemented on a data set based on the classification of those data. So in my policies, I would determine how the classification is going to work, how data is going to be classified on what parameters, and thus once the data gets classified, we are going to come back to standards where we say if it is classified as confidential data, we want to use encryption to protect that data, and we want AES 256 to be utilized for encryption. So how do we go about it? How do we implement the encryption? That's where your procedures come into the picture. Your guidelines are troubleshooting mechanisms, optional documents. So if somebody has trouble following the procedures, they might want to go into the guidelines and see how to troubleshoot the scenario that they are facing. Baselines are basically the minimum achievable target that you want to go with these policies. So let's say when I say I want to have a baseline on a server where for the server to be published onto the internet or to be used in production environment, it has to meet a certain criteria, which means I can go back to the hardware and I can say the server needs a hardware configuration of X, Y, and Z. Let's say a Xeon processor with 16 cores, 128 gigs of RAM. So that's a baseline that I need for a particular server for it to be put into production environment for a particular use. Anything above that is acceptable, but nothing should go below that. Then comes the risk management. While we are implementing these policies, procedures, we have those standards in place. If we face any risk during that period, or if we face any threat or a vulnerability is identified during this period, all these terms we are going to discuss in a little bit. So when we identify vulnerabilities or threats, that's where our risks come into the picture. The risk management comes in saying, okay, this is a risk that we have identified, and now how do we want to mitigate the risk? Then the security organization comes into the picture, the day-to-day activity of how security is to be implemented. And for all of these procedures, policies, baseline standards to be implemented, to be ensured that to be assured that they are working properly, we need to make our employees aware that these policies exist. This is something that they need to follow. Thus, the awareness or the security education comes into the picture. Here, the security education is more focused on helping employees adhere to the company policies and standards rather than educating employees about security. We don't want to make everybody an ethical hacker. We just want to ensure them or we want to assure the organization that everybody has been warned about policies, procedures, security requirements, and they are going to follow those requirements. For example, a password policy where you have to adhere to a specific password policy to ensure passwords are created. At the same time, there is another password policy which says that you should not share passwords with your colleagues no matter what. So for me, for my employees to follow that, I need to make them aware that these policies exist and there are repercussions if they do not follow these particular policies. So coming back to the governance part, what is governance since we have been talking about it? Governance ensures that the security strategies are aligned with business objectives and consistent with regulations. So what does it guarantee? Appropriate information security activities are being performed. Based on what? Based on the policies that we have created, based on the standards that we have and the baselines that we would have created. So security has to be comparable, right? So if I say I have secured against particular attacks, the attacks have to be identified. And then compared to those particular attacks, I can say I have mitigated these activities by having specific security controls. Thus, I can say that I am secure. The governance aspects keeps a watch on all these security controls to see that those security activities are ensured, are being implemented, and are performing to the best of their abilities. That's where your governance comes into the picture. The risks being reduced, so the risk management also comes under the governance where you're looking at newly identified risks and you're then implementing security controls that would mitigate these risks. Then we're looking at information security investments appropriately directed. So when I say I want a security control, which would be a firewall, IDS, IPS, antiviruses, whatever is required, it needs to have a return on investment which is acceptable for the organization. You don't want to spend up too much of money in security, thus creating losses for the organization. When you say a business objective is always to make money rather than lose money. So security should be a supporting feature to the business objectives, where the services are being provided by the business in a secure manner in such a way that they can still have a positive return on investment on the services that are being provided. And the executive management can determine the program's effectiveness. This is the major part, because we have to, even in any compliances, audits, technical audits, we have to prove that whatever we have implemented actually works, is effective, thus mitigating the risk. If your security controls are not effective, then you have just wasted a bucket load of money and have not achieved any security measures in your exercise. Moving on to security controls. Security controls are measures taken to safeguard an information system from an attack, basically for the CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So security controls could be administrative controls, technical controls, or physical security controls. What are administrative security controls? They would be policies, procedures that we have in place. So the password policy becomes an administrative control where the management has made everybody aware that the password needs to meet a particular complexity, should not be shared, and thus becomes an administrative security control. A technical security control would be where we are implementing this policy, and thus when I try to create a password, there is a software that maps the password to the complexity requirements, assures or ensures that the complexity requirements have been met, and thus allows the password to be accepted or rejects the password as the case may be. That is a security control. A physical security control may be, let's say, a CCTV camera which you're going to use to monitor people and ensure that nothing untoward happens. It's not only against physical crime, but let's say access to a particular room where nobody is seen tailgating. Maybe monitoring a server room which is very well secured and ensuring that unauthorized people do not get access, or purposefully or intently do not access that area at all times. So these are the three levels of security controls that can be implemented to enhance the security of an organization. Then we come to security policies. Policies is an overall broad statement produced by a senior management that dictates the role of security within the organization. For example, the password policy that we talked about, it just said that it needs to meet a certain complexity, which is a broad statement that is being made by the management saying we want to adhere to this policy to ensure that we do not get hacked by brute force attacks or dictionary attacks or whatever it is. The broad statement is trying to prevent certain attacks from happening on the organization. How it is implemented, that's where the procedures and everything else comes into the picture. It must integrate security into all business processes. So if I start creating a policy which ensures that the complexity should be so high that the password should be at least 20 characters strong, that would be detrimental to the organization's health because people may not remember those passwords, or resetting those passwords, or having technical mechanisms, technical security controls in place to implement that kind of stringent security may be too expensive to have. So whatever policies are created, they need to be in line with the business processes as well. The policy must be reviewed and modified periodically or as company changes. So as and when the company becomes more mature and can have more levels of security, they must look at their policies again and redefine them. Or as a company grows or changes market scenarios or changes business processes, these policies may become redundant. So you want to look at those policies and implement newer policies or modify the existing policies to suit the business processes in a better manner. It must support vision and mission of the organization. A business once established will always have a long-term vision. For example, the e-tailer example that we are talking about, for me to open a e-retailing website, I don't want it to be periodic. I don't want it to be for a month or something like that. I want to achieve success in that factor, and I want to create a plan of where I want to reach, let's say in the next 5 years. So how do I achieve that? That's something that I need to plan as a business plan. All my security mechanisms that are in place should be in alignment with the business plans, business visions across the number of years that we have envisaged the business to perform. So that's where the policies come into the picture. Policies are always long-term, not short-term documents, but need to be periodically reviewed and modified as the business grows or business changes its posture. Then looking at compliance. Compliance means conforming to a rule such as a specification, policy, standard, or law. So we have looked at compliance from a perspective where we talked about ISO 27001 or PCI DSS or those frameworks. Now these are not laws, but these are standards or frameworks that have been created over a period of time through experience. And these are targeted towards organizations, towards specific industries. For example, PCI DSS is only towards finance organizations where they have payment gateways in place. The ISO 27001 is a more generic policy which can be implemented by various organizations. HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, is an American act that talks about health-related data of its citizens. So these are compliances. These may not be laws, but you need to adhere to these to be effective and to be allowed to conduct business in that particular industry. Then we have Code of Ethics. Code of Ethics state safety of the Commonwealth, duty to our principles and to each other requires that we adhere and be seen to adhere to the highest ethical standards of behavior. Therefore, strict adherence to this code is a condition of certification. What are the ethics? Protect society, the Commonwealth and the infrastructure, act honorably, honestly, justly, responsibility and legally, prove diligent and competent service to the principles, advance and profession. Now, the code of ethics are codes created by ISC Square for the CISSP professional, and you need to adhere to these codes. If they identify violation of these codes from any member, they would debar the member, strip them of the certification, and even blacklist them based on whatever ethics they have violated. So even before the exam, you have to go through the code of ethics. You have to accept the code of ethics. In the exam, you may get up to 5 to 6 questions just on code of ethics. Then comes the legal systems. That's where the law comes into the picture. Law could differ from country to country or from region to region, and thus, depending on which country you're in, you may need to be aware of those laws of those countries. As far as CISSP is concerned, ISC Square is concerned, they are an American organization, so they would talk about mostly American laws and a few European laws or directives as well. So there are 3 different laws that we talk about: civil, common, and religious laws. Depends on the country, the culture of that particular country. The information security professional should understand the different legal systems followed internationally. So you also may come across the classification as civil law, criminal law, and law of torts. Civil law is basically a law where, let's say, a contract has been breached and it's not criminal in nature. You just want to sue an organization for breach of contract. Criminal law is where something criminal has happened under the particular act of that particular country, like let's say a murder or an attack that has happened, a physical attack, or something got stolen. And the third one was the law of torts, where it's more of a compensatory law where you can file a case, a civil suit, demand compensation in lieu of the wrongs that have happened to that particular organization or that individual. Then comes the personal security. The people inside the organization need access to data to complete their assigned work and hence have the potential to misuse these privileges. And thus, you should have personnel security as well. Now, when we talk about hiring practices for people, most of the organizations perform background checks, and we get confused why these background checks are being done. The background checks are essential to the health of the organization, where you are ensuring that the person is not a malicious person, has the prerequisite certifications or the qualifications, have never been debarred or have never been prosecuted, do not have a criminal background, thus preventing physical attacks on the organization. For example, a competitor may attempt to place in your organization a spy to gather information on the secrets of that organization and report it back to the competitor. A background check may reveal that this person was previously employed by a competitor, and thus you might want to verify that how that employment got terminated, when did it get terminated, or is this person misusing anything or misrepresenting any aspect of his or their life. Then you also need to get confidentiality agreements signed with them. For example, NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, data that is being shared with them, the ownership of that particular data, and what are the repercussions if that confidentiality is breached by that particular person. Conflict of interest agreements for positions handling competitive information. As you go higher up in the organization, you might come across contracts where it prohibits a particular person in engaging into the same activity with a competitor for a particular period of time. So if there is a conflict of interest when you're hiring a person where they have signed such a agreement with another competitor or another organization, you don't want to embroil yourself in a lawsuit where the other organization may sue you for hiring a person while they were still under that particular contract. So it's not only to look at the background of these people, but to safeguard the organization from any lawsuits or any violations of contract as well. Get the non-compete agreements for the positions in charge of unique corporate processes. That again goes on to say if you're going to leave the organization, you cannot start up a competing business similar to the organization's business and so on and so forth. Now let's come back to the technical aspect and start talking about vulnerability, threats, and risk. Now, what is a vulnerability? It is nothing but a weakness in a system or a process, implies the absence of a countermeasure. Vulnerability is internal and is more easily managed. So it's basically a flaw or a misconfiguration or a design flaw or something like using defaults, username, passwords, configurations, where if that particular flaw is misused, it will lead into a security event on that particular device for that particular organization. So when we say a security event, it has to be detrimental in nature. So if somebody is using a weak password that can easily be cracked, that is a vulnerability where you have identified a weak password, and then you want to prevent that vulnerability by imposing a security control or a countermeasure. The security control here starts off with the policy of having a robust security policy where a password policy comes in that describes the complexity of a particular password. And then you talk about a technical countermeasure where you have implemented an identity and access management plan, which would ensure that the person creating that password adheres to the complexity of that particular policy. Then a threat. The threat is the possibility that the vulnerability might be exploited, which will result in loss. So if somebody has created a weak password and it has been allowed, that's a vulnerability which can be exploited by the usage of brute force attacks or dictionary based attacks to crack passwords. If the password is cracked, somebody unauthorized may get access to that data, thus resulting in a loss for that organization. So the threat is the possibility of that particular vulnerability being exploited. And then comes the risk. The risk is basically the likelihood of that attack being happened. So I have a weak password. It can be exploited by a brute force or dictionary attack. The likelihood of that attack is what determines the risk level for me. Now the likelihood will always be hypothetical, but we don't want to run helter-skelter and we do not want to take the possibility to extreme. So that's where your business processes come into the picture. Your security policies come into the picture. Based on the business processes and the policies implemented, if I have a weak password, what would be the loss that I would face for that particular person? For example, a fresher coming into an organization having a weak password but having limited access to data would have a lesser risk because of the loss being lesser than a CEO of an organization using a weak password and thus getting exploited, because the CEO will have access to more proprietary data that if gets into the competitor's hand would lead in huge losses. Thus, the same risk of having a password cracked for a fresher will have a lesser loss, thus a lesser risk compared to the same risk to a CEO where the loss would be higher. So a threat could also be in multiple aspects. Threats could be natural, that means to fires, flooding, tornadoes, anything that is an act of God that can happen with minimal human interaction. Or the second threat would be man-made, where man is responsible for it, like theft, hacking, rioting, war, anything that is created by a man, or rather humans. And technical in nature could be software bugs where vulnerabilities are created, or server failures where something technical has gone wrong and you need a technical skilled person to come in and repair that particular aspect. Then the fourth one would be a supply system failure or a chain supply failure where you have dependencies. For example, any organization will have a dependency on an electricity service provider where they are providing electricity as a service which powers on the IT infrastructure. If the service provider fails and there is an electricity or a power cut, your systems are not going to work. Thus, you need a secondary mechanism to prevent that threat from being realized. Once we have identified these threats, we have identified these vulnerabilities, and we have identified the likelihood and the probability of that attack, that's where we come across the risk management exercise. Now, what is risk management? Risk management is a hypothetical exercise where we have identified a vulnerability, we have looked at the threat that it may have, and the likelihood of that threat being realized. Once we have identified the threat, the risk level, that's where the risk management comes into the picture. Reading from the slides, a core component of enterprise security program. Why? Because we need a baseline and we compare security to a baseline. For example, I've got a firewall that has been configured in a particular manner. Now, when I do a vulnerability assessment on the firewall, the vulnerability assessment gives me a report that states that some of the rules may now be redundant, thus allowing access to unauthorized users. This becomes a risk, or this becomes a threat. If this threat is identified by unauthorized people, they would then try to attack this firewall to gain access to that data which they are unauthorized to access, thus leading to losses for an organization. What is the likelihood of this happening? If the likelihood is high, or low, that's what the risk management program is all about, right? And based on these risks, we implement security controls, we manage the security controls, and then we verify the security controls for future risks to coming into the picture. It must be defined, and it is always defined as an ongoing project, because risks will always change based on the businesses, based on the security controls that you have. This will give a guidance to an organization of how security is being implemented, how it has enhanced over a period of time, and how security mature that organization has become because of the risk assessment program. It also helps you to satisfy two aspects: due diligence and due care. What is due diligence? Due diligence is basically the research that organization does in identifying those risks and mitigating them. The due care is the actual part of mitigation, where you have implemented a security control to mitigate the risk that you have identified. So if company is negligent, that means if the company doesn't have a risk management program, it is not going to be that security oriented, or the security is not going to be that great. Thus, the company may not comply to laws, regulations, and standards, thus causing them penalties, lawsuits, and other repercussions in the industry based on whatever they are doing. For risk management, we come to frameworks. The frameworks are used to categorize information systems so that we can identify threats or risks based on the classification. So these classification helps us determine the criticality and the sensitivity of information system, right? So what is the sensitivity and criticality? It basically gives us an understanding of the value of the asset that we have. So if you go back to domain 1, the asset value or the asset identification, asset security, that's where it comes into the picture. Obviously, a database server is going to be more secure than an end user laptop based on the data that they have. Thus, the criticality of the system for a database is much higher than an end user's laptop. Then we look at the security controls that can be implemented. Then for those, the frameworks like ISO 27001 comes into the picture. There is COBIT, there are a lot of frameworks out there, NIST 800-53. Then we talk about assessing the security controls. Once we have placed those security controls, we need to verify those controls are placed properly. They actually mitigate the risk and are appropriate to correctly mitigate that particular risk that they are created. Then looking at authorizing information systems, grant information systems operations based on risks determined. So you have identified risks, you have authorizing some of them, some of the devices to function in a particular manner based on which some of those risks would be mitigated or would be reduced to an acceptable level. So in the CISSP, we talk about a lot of risk assessment strategies. We look at how we can manage risks. The 4 different types of managing risks would be: one is to mitigate, other is to transfer, the third is to accept it, and the fourth one is to neglect the risk. So in the CISSP, it talks in great details about those risk assessment strategies. We are talking about the 4 types of risk mitigating strategies. They are risk avoiding or avoiding the risks, accepting the risk, transferring the risk, and limiting the risk. So in the course, we basically talk about a lot of risk strategies and how to mitigate these risks, and how they can be implemented to bring down to an acceptable level. So again, risk acceptance, risk appetite of an organization comes into the picture. These terms are then discussed in the training to understand how the policies would work around the risk management strategy. Moving on, then looking at monitoring security controls. So once we have security controls in place, we have assessed them, we also need to monitor them for the effectiveness, and though they are going to create any alerts or any risks are being realized, or any new risk that may be created by the security control implementation. So in these risk assessment, these are the frameworks, these are the steps that we want to follow to identify, mitigate, and monitor these risks. So the management begins with risk assessment. What do you mean by risk assessment? Identifying the impact of the risk that the risk would have on the organization. And there would be 2 different ways to assess the risk: a quantitative assessment or a qualitative assessment. A quantitative assessment is more quantifiable or is numerical in its process, where you're looking at assigning costs to particular assets and the threats. So the losses that you may figure out in a risk assessment strategy would be more numerical, where would be in a currency format, where let's say a risk, if realized, would lead to a loss of a X amount of dollars. That's where the quantitative analysis comes into the picture. The qualitative analysis would be quality of a service. So if a service is being affected because of a risk, what is the degradation of that service? To what aspect is it getting degraded? For example, internet that we use. if there is an internet outage or if there is a reduction in internet speed, right? So if I've got a 10 Mbps line and now because of some fault of the ISP, it gets reduced to 4 Mbps, I may not be able to conduct the business that I was doing on a 10 Mbps line. Thus, the quality of that device has degraded. Thus, it is a risk and it is causing me losses, right? So qualitative risk analysis would be more descriptive in nature rather than be numerical in nature. Most of the companies or organizations would follow a hybrid policy because it is not possible to have a quantitative risk analysis in each and every scenario. Newer organization which doesn't have much data to rely on, historical data of how threats have affected that particular organization, may go in for a qualitative one, and as they mature over time in the security practices, they may then turn over to a quantitative risk analysis or a hybrid risk analysis where they're using a combination of quantitative and qualitative both. Thus, the risk controls that we were talking about: risk acceptance, risk reduction, and risk assignment. There is risk avoidance as well. So there are 4 controls. The risk reduction is where you have implemented a security control based on which the risk has been reduced to a more acceptable level. Risk assignment is where you're also known as risk avoidance. That's where you're avoiding risk by outsourcing it. So talking about risk controls again, the 4 types being accept, avoid, transfer, and reduce. Risk acceptance is where the organization is willingly accepting the risk as the way it is because they don't want to deal with it right now. They might deal with it in the next iteration, or it is at an acceptable level and the company just wants to move on. Avoiding the risk is where you are going to try to not use the service where the risk exists. Thus, avoiding is where you have identified a particular service where the risk exists and now you're not using the service to avoid the risk altogether. Risk limitation or risk reduction would be where you are implementing a security control to mitigate the risk. And then risk transference is where risk assignment comes into the picture, where you are transferring it to a third party, like outsourcing it by using insurance to limit the risk. So for example, the threat is of a fire, the risk is high, but you cannot do anything about it. So you purchase insurance. So if the fire actually happens, you would still be reimbursed for the losses that you have faced. Coming back to countermeasures, we have discussed administrative countermeasures. These are policies, rules, regulations, laws, customs that a company needs to adhere to based on the industry that they are in. Then there are technical controls, software controls, anything that is technical in nature, IDS, IPS, firewalls, encryption, anything that is going to help you implement the CIA. And then physical, where you would look at locks on doors, security guards at fences, where they're preventing access to unauthorized people. Let's talk about roles and responsibilities of management. Now, as far as management is concerned, or the hierarchy is concerned, you can see on the screen there's a senior management, the security professional, data owner, custodian, and user. Now these are from exam perspective, from the certification perspective. Obviously the hierarchy in an organization would be slightly different, but here the senior management is the responsible party for the entire security mechanism. So they must drive the entire security program. So CISSP talks about a top-down approach where the senior management has realized the importance of security and is implementing at all levels within the organization. Thus, they are a part of it and they are supporting the security program. They define the tolerance of risk of how much risk is to be tolerated by an organization from a monetary perspective or the qualitative perspective as well, depending on the laws, legislations, regulations, compliances, and the contracts that the business has signed. They will rely on security professionals to manage the risk, but the exercise and the management process has to be defined by the senior management. Once the security team comes up with the countermeasures, the senior management either approves or disapproves them based on the return on investment of that countermeasure. The security professional assists with the development of policy documents, gives their inputs because they are the people who are in the day-to-day process of dealing with these. Thus, they can identify gaps and give good inputs to modify or to create the policy in a more robust manner. The security professionals may be a part of the risk assessment and risk management team as well, especially the security technical aspects of it, assist with the implementation and maintenance of countermeasures. So the administrative, technical, or physical measures that you have identified, you may be requested to implement that. For example, the locks that we have on the door, the swipe locks, They are connected to a database where the database is maintained. So as a security professional, you wouldn't be responsible to fit those locks, but to create the database, manage and maintain the database where that information is kept upon, where people are authorized and authenticated, and would be responsible for monitoring, auditing, and security assessments as well. The data owner, the owner of that particular data part, would normally be the head of the department. For example, the sales data is normally owned by the director of sales of that department, so that they would be ultimately responsible for identifying that data, classifying that data, and accepting the security controls that are implemented. They may request for additional security controls if they deem fit. The security professional implements these security controls. Then the custodian, a person who is responsible for implementing the approved security controls or managing the day-to-day activity of the security controls. For example, the security professional has identified an access control to be implemented on a data set that the data owner owns. The data owner has approved of it. It is the custodian who is going to implement that strategy or implement the control on it. The user is basically the user who or the person who accesses the information and IT resources, does whatever access controls have been implemented, would identify the user, authenticate, authorize them, and hold them accountable for whatever they are doing. If the user is unable to authenticate, access would be denied.
We will focus on the second domain of CISSP, which is asset security. So let's understand the need for asset security through a small scenario. Well, it was yet another regular day in Tim's organization. Everything was going on fine until the organization faced a cyber attack. The hacker hacked all the servers in Tim's organization. The organization had loads of data. Not all of the data had the same level of protection. The level of protection varied from one piece of information to another. In this scenario, the hacker could hack into only that particular data which was less protected. However, this cyber attack had a huge impact on the organization. In addition to this, it was also discovered that there was some flaw in the information classification process that exposed even sensitive data to a cyber attack. In other words, even crucial data was left with very less protection. This gave rise to asset security. Asset security is defined as the process of collecting and protecting assets such as data and devices. Asset security helps an organization understand and classify data with respect to its importance, which in turn makes sure that highly valuable data receives the most protection. Asset security achieves its goals through its domains. The domains are information classification, then we have data classification, data lifecycle, data remnants, and finally we have data loss prevention. Each of these domains have different goals. All of these domains together make up asset security. Now let's have a look at each of these domains individually. First up, we have information classification. As you saw what happened in Tim's organization, it is understood that importance of data varies largely. We have to classify data before we can move on to protecting it. We need to be able to identify which is the most crucial data with respect to our organizations. Information classification is defined as the process of segregating data based on its importance to provide adequate level of protection to every piece of data. Information classification is different for each sector. Based on their objectives, the classification varies. In the general sector, information classification is used to minimize risks on crucial information, whereas in the government or military sector, it is used to prevent unauthorized access. And finally, in the commercial sector, it is used to keep sensitive information private. Here, it is seen to it that information is not disclosed to a company's competitors. Let's now move on to our second domain, that is data classification. As the name suggests, here data is basically classified based on a set of considerations. Here we will look into factors like data retention requirements, then data security requirements, data disposal methods, data encryption requirements, and finally compliance requirements. So these are the factors which are taken into consideration while classifying data. This entire process of data classification is taken care of by the data owner. In addition to the classification, they also analyze the use and value of the available data to the company. Finally, the data owner also annually reviews the data classification. Before classifying data, an important step is to understand the data life cycle. All of us speak of data all the time. However, do we know the various steps a piece of data goes through? Well, for that, let us have a look at the third domain, data lifecycle. We will start off from the data creation step and understand what happens to the data after that. As you see on your screens, we have 6 steps in the data lifecycle stage. They are create, store, use, share, archive, and destroy. Starting off with the create phase. This is the first step in data lifecycle. Here, new data is generated or the existing data is updated. After the data is created, we use data repositories to store the created data. Without storing data, we cannot derive any information from it. Hence, this step is very crucial. In the third phase, data is viewed or used in some application or processed. In addition to data being viewed and processed, it is also shared between various users and customers. Our fifth phase is archive. Here, data which is not used frequently, that is, inactive data, is identified and then moved into long-term storage systems. And finally, we have the destroy phase. As the name suggests, data is simply destroyed here. Data can be destroyed either digitally or physically. Not to forget, you cannot simply destroy data. It should be done based on regulations. But have you wondered what happens if data is not destroyed even after we try our best to erase it? Well, this gives rise to data remnants. In simple words, data remnants is a term used for the residual of digital data which remains even after attempting to erase that particular data. Data remnants should be avoided as it is not good to have remains of a piece of data which was intended to be destroyed. Security professionals should be well versed with techniques to avoid data remnants. So how do we tackle data remnants? For this, we have various methods. They are purging, clearing, overwriting, degaussing, storing, and finally, destruction. Let's have a look at each of these methods individually and understand how they help in tackling data remnants. First up, we have purging. Purging is done to minimize risks on crucial information. In clearing, data from storage devices are removed. However, it can be reconstructed by using various softwares. Third, we have overwriting. Here, we write over the original data several times so that the original data cannot be recovered. Degaussing is the method used to destroy data on magnetic storage tapes. Next up, we have storing. Before storing data on media, the data is encrypted for the purpose of safety. Finally, the sixth method is destruction. Here, storage devices which hold the data are physically damaged. Incineration, crushing, and shredding are few of the methods used for destruction. Now let's move on to our fifth domain, data loss prevention. In this domain, various security measures are adopted that will help in making data available to only the authorized users. Here, we will look into 4 of such measures. The first measure is data inventory. In this step, data is identified and then classified. In the second step, the data flow is plotted over the life cycle. The third measure is data protection strategy. Here, a number of risk assessments are performed. The fourth measure is implementation. In this step, we take up cases which have had a history of data loss for testing purpose. Those were the 5 domains under asset security. In addition to these, it is also required that we understand the term privacy with respect to asset security. Privacy is a very crucial aspect when it comes to asset security. Information privacy and data privacy are more or less the same. This term is used to differentiate one person from another. It relates to the personal data stored on computers. So what kind of data falls under this category? Well, we have data such as medical records, office data, financial data, etc. which fall under this category. To uphold privacy, we use technologies like pseudonymization, tokenization, and anonymization. Well, pseudonymization refers to a data management process. Anonymization refers to a process of either encrypting or removing personally identifiable data so that people who the data describes remain anonymous. And finally, in tokenization, a sensitive piece of data is substituted with a non-sensitive equivalent.
CISSP stands for the Certified Information Security, or rather Certified Information System Security Professional. It is considered as a gold standard in the field of information security. It is a management certification. So when you're in the senior management, this is the kind of certifications that you would require for your management skills. Now, this is a non-technical or a semi-technical certification. Here, it's nothing about vulnerability assessment or penetration testing. You're not going to do anything hands-on. You are not expected to know hacking, or you're not expected to know how to configure firewalls, antiviruses, and whatnot. It's basically something that over a period of years of experience, you have evolved a certain understanding of how security policies should be constructed, how they should be implemented, and how security affects an organization. So here you are responsible to create an overall security policy for an organization to help maintain the security posture of an organization. Now, as far as the certification is concerned, it has a validity of 3 years, after which you don't have to give the exam again. However, during these 3 years, you have to earn a certain point. So it is known as a continuing education points that ISC Square allows you to generate points by attending lectures or by attending webinars, by publishing white papers, by providing trainings. Obviously, all of these should be authorized, and you should have a validation from an authorized party that you have done this activity. Once it is verified, you will be awarded certain points. Once you have collected sufficient number of points, you will retain your certification beyond the 3 years. The passing rate of this exam is less than 50%. So it's not how much you require to score. What this basically tells you is the amount of people who actually clear the exam in the first attempt. Now, let's not get disheartened because of this. Essentially, the exam is quite tough. It's known as a mile wide and inch deep exam. That means you need to know just about everything and anything that is there to be known in information security. And that's something that we are going to discuss when we go into the 8 domains of CISSP. What happens is there are a lot of people who are not actually prepared for the exam, who think they are prepared, attempt the exam, and sadly fail in their first attempts. Some people just misjudge the exam and not prepared for it. So the fact that I'm trying to put across is be very well prepared. I've seen people who study for months together, attempt a lot of questions, ensure that their knowledge is up to the mark, and only then do they attempt the exam. Anybody can register for the exam, to be honest, and clear the exam as well. However, to get certified, there are 2 different avenues. So if you have experience of at least 5 years in 2 of the domains that are in the CISSP course, you get certified. So even if you clear the exam, there is a validation process that happens after the exam where you have to submit documentation to prove to ISC Square that you have that level of experience. And once it is proven and validated, you get certified as a CISSP. If you do not have that 5 years of experience, you get certified as an associate of ISC Square for CISSP, and they give you 6 years during which you can achieve the level of experience, prove it to them, and then get certified as a CISSP. So you can see the stringent levels that are taken for this certification. The validation is basically documentation and proof that you have to submit and which is verified. So even after you clear an exam, to get validated and get certified, it can take up to 5 to 6 weeks for ISC Square to validate and provide you with the certification. With that, let's go and see the exam. Let's have an overview of what the exam is all about. The governing body is ISC Square. That's what we have been referring to. And the professional experience, at least 4 years of college degree or additional credentials from ISC Square's approved list that will satisfy 1 year of required experience and 5 years of paid full-time work experience in 2 or more domains. Like I said, anybody can give the exam, register for it, attempt it. Once you clear, then that's where the criteria of your work experience comes into the picture. You prove 5 years of experience, probably by a letter from your organization, from your HR saying you have this kind of experience that is relevant to the certification. They will, ISC Square will validate it, you get the certification. If you don't have that experience, you get associate of ISC Square, and then you get 6 years to attain that level of experience, after which you can get certified. The exam fees, $699, so it's an expensive exam. A single attempt for each voucher. So if you fail, that's another $700 for the second attempt. The fact being, if you fail for the first time, you cannot attempt the exam for the next 30 days. If you fail for the second time, you cannot attempt the exam again for the next 60 days. And if you fail for the third time, you cannot attempt the exam for another 90 days. So there's a cooling off period after each attempt. So I would suggest study hard, go for the first attempt, clear it, and nail it. The maintenance fees for your certification is again $85 for 3 years. The exam length is 3 hours, and the questions could vary from 100 to 150. 150 being the max questions that can be asked in that exam. You can clear the exam well before 150 questions, so be prepared for that as well. But imagine when you're walking into that exam, bear in mind that you will be asked 150 questions and you have to time those in 3 hours. 180 minutes, that's what 3 hours is. So if you do the math, not much time for every question. So it's just a minute and a half or less than that for each question. And the questions could be very descriptive, could be confusing. So you have to have your mental faculties really strong during the exam. The passing score is 700 out of a possible 1000 points. Exam language is English. Testing centers, there are ISC Square authorized centers where you need to book that exam. There's a huge process that you have to follow too, where you go for the exam itself. So once you have registered on the ISC Square portal and you purchase the voucher, they will give you a list of centers in your vicinity that you can look into. They'll give you a calendar to give you the possible dates that you can attempt the exam on. Select the center, select the date. Reach the center at least half an hour before the scheduled time. There is a verification, so you have to carry your identification, a government issued document, either a passport, driver's license, where you have to prove that you are who you say you are. And once the verification is done, only then do you get to attempt the exam. The question formats are 3 types: multiple choice, drag and drop, and hotspots. Multiple choice is the format that we are going to look at when we look at sample questions. It's the same. They give you a question, they give you 4 options. Either one or more options need to be chosen. They will specify if there is more than one answer to that particular question. In a drag and drop, it's more like match the following. So there will be a column A and column B, and they'll ask you a question and say, okay, column A gives you the options, drag and drop whichever correct answer is from column A to column B, and then submit the answer. If the answer is correct, you get awarded the points, else there is no negative marking. The third is a hotspot. A hotspot question is basically a diagram, let's say, an architectural diagram that will be presented to you, and they will ask you to pinpoint a certain aspect within that diagram. For example, they may give you an architectural overview of a network, of how it has been established, and they will ask you for a network-based firewall, which is the most likeliest area that you want the firewall to be placed in. So you don't need to know how to configure the firewall, but from an architectural perspective, you need to know where that firewall needs to be placed for it to be the most effective for the given scenario in the question. These are the domains that are asked. So you can see it basically covers anything and everything that is there in information security. It starts off with security and risk management, which weighs 15% in your questions, in your exam. So if your exam is 115 questions, 15% would be around 22 odd questions. And risk management being one of the most important topics for these kind of certifications. Then asset security, which covers 10% of your questions, so that's around 15 questions. Security architecture and engineering, this is where your infrastructural knowledge, your security architecture, your enterprise architecture, all those come into the picture. There are a lot of theoretical models that you need to study in domain 3. And that covers 13% of your exam. Communications and network security. This is the most technical topic within all these 8 topics. This is where you talk about networks, you talk about TCP/IP, you discuss protocols like TCP, UDP, you discuss different attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, DOS attacks, and this basically has 14% of weightage. Then you have identity and access management, which basically talks about users, subjects, objects, subject being the user, object being the resource, and a relationship between these to be created where people are authorized for some activity, authenticated, and only then allowed and also held accountable for whatever activity they have done. Then you go into security assessment and testing, so vulnerability assessments, penetration test, software testing, SAS, TAST a little bit. All those will be covered in domain number 6, which has 12% weightage. Then security operations, so security operations center or the SOC, day-to-day management of incidents. So your incident management would come into the picture, problem management, change management, all of those things would come under domain 7 as security operations, which has 13% of weightage. And then finally, software development security. Now, you don't need to know development or you don't need to know any programming. There are no program-based questions. They're not going to ask you how to code. They're going to ask you how to manage a software development lifecycle or a secure software development lifecycle. So this is where your waterfall models, modified waterfall models, spiral, agile, DevOps, DevSecOps all come into the picture. And this has 10% of weightage. Now it is near about impossible for everyone or anyone to get experience across all these domains. So you will have your strong points and you will have your weak points. The task is to identify where you're good at, understand those things, make the maximum out of it, then identify your weak points and start developing on those. If you're able to look at it from a theoretical perspective, however, if you can get an internship or if you can get you can say just an insight of how it works in the practical world, it would be very helpful. Now, that being said, as far as CISSP exam is concerned, it involves a very ideal world. The real world actually doesn't come into the question because the real world will have a lot of business logic to it. By business logic, what do we mean? Every organization will modify their projects based on the expertise that they have, based on the talent that they have, and based on the people or the hierarchy of the organization that has been established. So it can be customized to each and every organization. Since an exam cannot deal with these kind of customizations, we deal with an ideal world. So for the CISSP exam, we assume that we have all the resources, we have all the people that are required, we have an hierarchy in the training which is given out where we have rules for each and every person and job titles for each and every person, right? So when we go through the training, it is very essential that we understand what these job roles are, what their responsibilities are, so that when we get those questions, we can identify which person is going to attempt what. In the real world, things are very different. We piggyback, we take on multiple responsibilities, and that is something that CISSP doesn't adhere to. So you have to be very careful. Identify the job roles, identify the responsibilities, have that map, the hierarchical map created very well, and then try to implement the ideal world scenario from the CISSP standards to see what is going to happen. That being said, let's move on. Let's discuss the domains. Now, these domains we've already seen. What we can do is we are going to move on to the sample questions for each and every domain. Once we reach the domain, we'll see what the topics in that domain are. We'll look at the sample questions. Then we will go to the next domain, see the topics in that domain, and then look at the sample questions as well. So, what to study and those sample questions revolving them. So, looking at the first module or first domain, security and risk management. Now, this is one of the largest domains that could be debatable. For me, I would say the largest domain could be domain number 3, security architecture and engineering. Could also be domain number 4 because it is quite technical, communications and network security. And could also be security operations because that's incident management, change management, problem management altogether. But each domain is very important from the exam's perspective. If you're thinking about keeping a domain for options, forget it. That's not the right way to address the exam. Let's start off with the first one, security and risk management. This domain teaches you all about information systems management, and this talks about risks and everything. So what we are going to do is we are just going to go to the official document from ISC Square where these domains and their topics are given. So that's the exam outline from ISC Square towards CISSP. This is the latest document that is there available online. You can see the URL in my browser address bar, and these are the 8 domains. This is the exam, 3 hours, number of questions 100 to 150, multiple choice and advanced innovative questions. That's where the drag and drop and the hotspot comes into the picture. Though based on experience, I can tell you that 90% of your questions will be multiple choice. 10% would either be drag and drop and hotspots. Passing grade is 700 out of 1000 points. Exam language availability is English. Those who want to attempt in other languages, it is available, but then the exam is 6 hours and the questions are 250. So that's your option depending on which language you're most comfortable with. We are going to go with English. That's the language options coming in CISSP linear exam. 6 hours, 250 questions. Everything else remains the same. These are the languages supported: French, German, Brazilian, Portuguese, Spanish, Japanese, simplified Chinese, and Korean. The weightage, I guess, remains the same. And that's the first domain, security and risk management. So what does it pertain to? Understand and apply concepts of CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. In the first video, we have gone through all the 8 domains at quite some length. We have discussed what CIA is all about and how the interrelationship is. So if you want a deep dive, or rather a deeper dive than what we are doing for the domains, go back to the first video, look into that, and then you can come back to this video again. So evaluate and apply security governance principles. So we have to understand what governance is. Now, governance is basically having a overlying architectural security policy that can be integrated with an enterprise architecture. And thus, having your security policy in alignment with the business goals and objectives. Security should never become a hindrance for a business. Security should always become a supporting feature which should allow the business to be executed in a secure manner. So, as a security expert, our first goal is to identify what the business does, what the business processes are, what is the business trying to achieve, and then we try to create a security policy revolving these to enhance the business functionality in a overall picture. So you're looking at organizational processes, acquisitions, divestitures. Acquisition is when, let's say, scenarios where you are trying to create a security governance policy. Now the business is trying to change because they're trying to acquire another organization and merge it within this organization. And now your security policy should encompass not only your organization but the newly acquired organization. Let's say in the next 5 years, a business decides that the newly acquired organization is no longer profitable and they want to sell it off. And now that's where the divestiture comes into the picture. You are now trying to separate the entity that you have just integrated in your security policy, and you're now trying to separate it with confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the company's data intact without affecting the organization at any point in time. Understand the fact that security is not only about hacking or getting hacked, it's about being secure at all points in time during business continuity and business, let's say, business as usual kind of activities. So that's where your security control frameworks would come in. You're going to talk about ISO 27001. We're going to talk about COBIT, PCI DSS, NIST 800 series, and so on and so forth. And the most two important statements or terms in the CISSP is due care and due diligence. Due care is you doing your own research to identify what security controls need to be implemented or what kind of governance needs to be implemented. And due diligence is you yourself spending that much time, money, effort into implementing those decisions that you have come across during the due care, thus enhancing the security functions of an organization. So when we talk about business requirements, for a business to be effective, at the same time, it needs to be legal, it needs to be compliant to regulations and laws and to the contracts that have been created by the organization. So as far as the concept goes, when we say that security needs to be in alignment with the business requirements, the business requirements imply that the business is legal, is compliant to regulations, is compliant to their contractual obligations, and is following standards that have been prescribed to them. So all of them come together, and that's where your security mapping comes into the picture. You're looking at legal and regulatory issues like cyber crimes and data breaches, licensing and intellectual property requirements, and so on and so forth. And it will also include ISC Square's Code of Professional Ethics. Now, this is a document apart from the 8 domains that we have talked about. Thus, what does this document talk about? This is the prescription from ISC Square of professional ethics for a cybersecurity professional. Expect around 4 to 5 questions from professional ethics as well. So not only is this a document that you need to read and adhere to, you will be questioned upon this in your exam, and these are easy points to score. Professional ethics, something that is ethical, something that is not against the law. So it's kind of quite easy, but the questions can be confusing, so you need to go through the entire document really well. And then your organization will have its own code of ethics. However, if you look at the hierarchy, ISC Square's ethics comes first. So your organizational ethics should not be contradictory to ISC Square's ethics in the first place. Then develop, document, and implement security policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines. Identify, analyze, and prioritize business continuity requirements. So here, that's where your risk assessment comes into the picture. If you're looking at a particular risk, that means a particular vulnerability has been identified. You want to see the likelihood of that vulnerability being exploited, and then the business impact analysis that it may have, based on which you would then create a plan to mitigate that particular risk by having a business continuity or a disaster recovery plan coming into the picture. Now, this is, as far as this domain is concerned, you're calculating the risk. It doesn't actually tell you how to mitigate that risk. That's when you go into the next future domains and discuss those technicalities. So you can see contribute and enforce personnel security policies. Now, the thing about CISSP is physical security also comes into the picture. Why? Because if hardware is not well protected, there would be physical attacks, social engineering attacks that could be created, which would lead to data leakage as well. And the first and the foremost, most valuable asset of an organization is always human. personnel. So CISSP would also deal with people protection in the first place. For example, protecting people against social engineering attacks, making them aware about these attacks. If there are natural calamities, you have to plan for them during your disaster recovery and business continuity plan, and ensure that people are safeguarded. Not only that, you have to tie these things up with identity and access management. For example, account creation, account management, onboarding of employees, offboarding, termination of employees, third-party contractors, consultants that you're going to hire which are not employees but third parties coming in to your organization providing intelligence, and so on and so forth. So all of those come into the picture as well. And then that's where your risk management concepts come in. It gives you a very good overview of how to identify those risks and so on and so forth. Now, this is what the first domain is all about. It itself is very huge. And as we go ahead, we can tie this domain to the rest of the domains. For more deeper analysis, go to the first video and then we can come back to this. So let's start with the questions. The first question, now these are very short one-liner questions. Your exams would be more descriptive. To be very honest with you, if you go online, no matter what practice questions that you try or whatever dumps, if you can find those, you will find none of them will be ever any close to the actual exam questions. You will find a lot of sites online that sell you CISSP dumps with 100% guarantee for you to clear. Don't fall for that. It's just a money-making scam. Those questions will be similar questions, something that will give you an insight of what the exam is going to be. But when you attempt the exam, you will find out that those questions are way different from the actual exam itself. Coming back to the questions, the primary goal of security awareness program is, now what is a security awareness program and why is it created? The primary goal. So is it to provide a platform for disclosing exposure and risk analysis, to make everyone aware of potential risk and exposure, to provide accurate risk and exposure results, a way of communicating security procedures? Now the answer to this is to make everyone aware of potential risk and exposure. Doesn't mean that you're trying to make everybody an ethical hacker. What you're trying to do is, in your organization, you are trying to create a security awareness program which allows your employees to know what kind of policies exist in your company, what rules need to be followed, what are the procedures that need to be followed for them to safeguard themselves and company assets as well, and ensure that data leakage and data loss are kept at a minimum. So you're basically trying to make everyone aware of the risks that they may have. For example, social engineering, not clicking on links, not going to unwanted sites, and so on and so forth. Question 2, a contingency plan should address which of the following? Potential risks, residual risks, or identified risks. Now, what is a potential risk? A potential risk is something that you may foresee in the future, something that may exist. A residual risk, we'll come to that. What is an identified risk? A risk that has been identified, is known to the organization, and the organization is aware of it. So potential is something that may come into the future. Identified is something that exists right now. A residual risk, on the other hand, is a risk that was identified earlier on, mitigated, but after mitigation, there is still an amount of residual risk that exists. So these terminologies need to be understood really well. Let me give you an example of a residual risk. So let's say there's a SQL injection flaw that has been identified in an application, and that's now an identified risk. Now you've got two options in front of you: go through a software development lifecycle again, recode that part of the application to mitigate the risk, or else have a security control like a firewall, a web application firewall watching that risk. Now the ideal scenario would be that you go through the development process again, but that is going to take time. So you put in a compensatory control, that is a web application firewall in the meanwhile to mitigate that risk, and then have the recoding done, and then later on resolve the risk altogether. So when we put in the firewall to mitigate the risk temporarily, is the risk actually addressed? No, there is still a possibility of a SQL injection attack happening, but we just have it mitigated to a certain extent because there is a firewall watching it. So that means that there is still a residual risk, a risk that is remaining even after me implementing the security protocol or the security control. That is what a residual risk is. Something that remains even after I put in a security control, which can be taken care of later on or can be accepted and just moved upon. So coming back to the question, a contingency plan should address which of the following? Either a potential risk, a residual risk, an identified risk, or all of the above. And the correct answer to that is a residual risk. What is a contingency plan? A contingency plan is, I still have a security control, but something may go wrong. And for that, I want a secondary control to be in place to ensure if the first control fails, the second control would still be able to identify that and stop the security incident happening. So we are looking at residual risks and then having a contingency plan to manage those residual risks. Question 3. When the cost of the countermeasures outweigh the cost of the risk, the best way to handle the risk is to reject the risk, transfer the risk, accept the risk, or reduce the risk. Now, there are 4 ways a risk can be managed, right? Accept the risk, avoid the risk, transfer the risk, or mitigate the risk, right? Rejecting the risk is not an option. But what is the question? Cost of a countermeasure outweighs the cost of the risk. So what is the cost of a risk? The cost of a risk is basically the impact that the organization is going to face in a monetary manner if the risk is realized. To mitigate that, we have a countermeasure in place. So if in the previous example, I have identified a SQL injection attack, and the countermeasure to that is me implementing a security control, a web application firewall to mitigate that risk. However, if somebody executes that risk, somebody does a SQL injection attack, the loss that I'm facing is only $100 per incident. And the maximum incidents that can happen in a year are 10. So 10 into 100 is $1,000 per annum is what that risk is going to cost me. For me to implement a web application firewall, on an annual level, it is going to cost me, let's say, $15,000 in licenses, management, salaries, and all of those things. Which means that I'm facing a loss of $1,000, but I'm spending $15,000 to prevent that loss. I'd rather have the $1,000 loss than spend $15,000, right? So, in this scenario, the cost of the countermeasure is outweighing the cost of the risk by $14,000. So, in this scenario, which is the best way I would do it? Either reject the risk, which is never an option because you cannot reject the risk. Transfer the risk. What is transferring a risk? Transferring it to a third party by purchasing insurance, example, right? So if I purchase insurance saying if this gets compromised, it's the insurance company who's going to make the payments. I'm safeguarded. Or accept the risk or reduce the risk. So in this scenario, accepting the risk is basically accepting the risk the way it is, moving on because there is nothing that you can do about the risk and you're willing to accept the risk rather than spend money on it. And reduce the risk is mitigating the risk by implementing the firewall and spending that money and then incurring those losses. So the best answer out of this is accepting the risk. Why can't I transfer the risk? Because there is no such insurance where I can, in the given example, where I can get that kind of an insurance policy. Reducing the risk would entail me spending that $15,000 to mitigate the $1,000 risk, thus incurring a $14,000 loss, which is against the business logic. A business needs to make money, not spend money. And that's the fourth option that's left, that's accepting the risk, which means we are not going to implement the firewall because it is outweighing the cost of the risk. We are just willing to accept the risk itself and move on. That's the first domain. Moving on to the second, which is asset security, consists of topics about physical requirements of information security. Let's go back to the document in hand. So moving on to domain 2, asset security. We talk about assets. Assets could be, now, okay, let's get into the definition of what an asset is. Asset could be anything that has a monetary value associated with it from the organization's perspective. It could be data, it could be virtual assets, it could be physical assets, it could be anything and everything. It could be a license, right? You purchase an operating system. The operating system comes with a virtual license that installs on your machine or is associated with an email address. Even that license has a value, thus even that license will become an asset. So the basic definition is anything and everything that is owned by the organization and has a monetary value associated with it, right? Thus we talk about asset classification as well. Asset classification could be data. Within data itself, there would be sub-classifications like confidential data, non-confidential data, public data, and so on and so forth. Physical assets, virtual assets, networking assets, anything and everything that you can come across would be classified here. Determine and maintain information and asset ownership. So your asset management program comes into the picture. And when you say asset ownership, the organization owns the assets as they are. However, roles and responsibilities that you have created in the organization will ensure that some assets are virtually owned by somebody. That means that they are responsible for the well-being of that asset. So you have to identify who, for example, HR. Now, HR is a function, human resources, but they also need IT assets. For example, a payroll, which will institute a payroll software, a database, right? A web application server, if you will. And all of these assets are now owned by the HR department. So there are hundreds of people in HR. So who exactly owns this? That's where we identify the owner of that particular asset, saying you are responsible for the well-being of these assets. You belong to this department. So normally the head of that department would be the owner of those assets and would determine what kind of access controls, what kind of maintenance, management, security mechanisms are required. Then we talk about protection privacy. So data owners, data processors, remnants, collection limitations, determining, ensuring appropriate asset retention. So let's say data, right? Even if I have data, how long do I retain data? If you go into privacy acts of organizations or of countries rather, so GDPR for European Union, GDPR basically states that you will only retain personal identifiable information for as long as the organization requires it. The moment you have no reason to have that data with you, you're going to delete that data. So which means automatically says you're going to retain that data till it makes business sense. Once you figure out it is not required, you're going to delete it in a secure manner, which is not recoverable to unwanted parties. So you have to determine those asset retention periods. We have to understand what those retention periods are. So even for your physical assets, there will be life of the asset that is associated with it. And once the life of that asset is over, even if the asset is working properly, you have to discard that asset and you have to replace it. You have to do this with security in mind. Then the security controls for all of these things. Understanding data states. Data states could be in three different aspects: data in motion, data at rest, and data in use. How are you going to secure data during all these three stages? What are the protection methods that you're going to utilize? Then establishing information and asset handling requirements. So that's what domain 2 is all about. Let's look at the questions. So the first question in domain 2, which of the following is responsible for setting user clearances to computer-based information? Is it operators, data owners, security administrators, or data custodians? Understand the question. Who is responsible for setting your user clearances to computer-based information? And the correct answer to that is security administrators. They are responsible for setting the user clearances. Who are going to be responsible for allowing the user clearances? That's going to be data owners. What is generally concerned with personal security? Management controls, operational controls, technical controls, or human resource controls. Now, what is personal security? Personal security is people-centric security. You're looking at people and you're ensuring that their security comes into the picture. Technical controls can be used for data assets or physical assets like information technology, but technical controls may not be that relevant for a human. A firewall is not going to help any human any which ways. Management controls are administrative controls. That means a policy that will help you implement controls. But for personal security, it's the operational controls that are going to be associated with it. Which of the following factors determines the frequency of information security audits in any given environment? So the age-old question, for you to remain secure, how often do you want to conduct a security audit to verify your vulnerabilities, your penetration test, to verify your security controls are working properly? So would it be dependent upon asset value, the risk-based approach, management discretion, or level of realized threats? And here the answer to that question is risk. The moment a risk is identified, for example, at what various stages would a security audit be triggered for an individual asset as well? And that can be tied down to incident management, change management, and problem management. So if there is an incident, a security incident with a database server where there has been an attack on that server, I probably want a security audit done on that server to identify vulnerabilities, flaws, and then to mitigate those risks. Similarly, if there is a change that has been going on into your organization, you first want to go into a risk assessment strategy, and then you want to look at security audits based on the risks that you have identified, right? So a security audit is not only periodic based on compliances or regulations, but it also can be integrated really well in your incident management, problem management, and change management scenarios. That's domain number 2. All right, let's talk about domain 3, security architecture and engineering. Now, this is where you tie up security architecture and enterprise architecture. If you look at the first domain, we have talked about risk assessments, we have talked about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and then we have moved on to the second domain where we talked about asset security. So that's where we talked about data classification, asset classification. Now, it starts off with the enterprise level architecture. So something like TOGAF. What is enterprise level architecture? It's basically data center architect and a network architect trying to create data flows, deciding how communications are going to happen between various devices. They're going to try to do network segmentation for web application servers, database servers, look at network isolations, network access control lists, and may even decide how firewalls and where firewalls would be required. Once that architecture is created, we need to secure that architecture to ensure that whatever data communications are happening within that framework, they are secured in a manner where all the risks that the organization may be exposed to are either managed, mitigated, accepted, transferred, whichever the way it is, right? So here you start off with physical security, you start off with trusted platform modules. So looking at the outline, this is where it starts off with implement and manage engineering processes using secure design principles. So this domain will talk about using TOGAF and then using a Zachman framework to interact with all the data owners, all the asset owners, querying them about the security of the assets, the requirements, because it is not the security architect who determines how secure the device will be. It is the asset owner who determines the requirement of security. For example, continuing with the HR example that we were talking about earlier, if the HR department of head is responsible for the database, for the payroll application, it is that person who would be determining the security levels. So based on the security architecture, let's say a Zachman framework, we would create a questionnaire that needs to be filled out by the asset owner, the HR department of head, and would be supplied to us, the security heads, and then we would try to create a security profile based on their requirements. So if the HR department head comes back to me and says that they require to be adhering to a particular standard or they want X kind of security, it is us who will validate that requirement and it is us who will execute it and protect that asset based on their requirements. So this is where your security architecture meets enterprise architecture by using various frameworks. This domain will introduce you to not only Zachman framework, it will again take you to a trusted platform module. It will talk about ITSec, TCSec, common criteria, and so on and so forth. So this is again a very extensive module. Some people struggle with it because it is a largely a theoretical module, and some people would struggle with the concept of what is a security architecture and an enterprise architecture. It is very important to understand the differences between them. For example, TOGAF is an enterprise architecture where a data center architect would deploy and streamline those devices on which a layer of security architecture such as ISO 27001 would be implemented to enhance the security and ensure that the infrastructure remains protected at all point in time. This module will also deal with managing vulnerabilities on assets, applications, web-based systems, mobile systems, and embedded devices. So this is where your engineering comes into the picture. By this module, we mean when we are deploying infrastructure, we need to engineer it with security in mind. We need to architect in such a way that security enhances the business needs, business requirements, and they are executed in a secure manner. Let's look at a few questions based on domain 3. Question 1. When a computer uses more than one CPU in parallel to execute instructions, it is known as multiprocessing, multitasking, multithreading, or parallel running. Now, here we need to understand what is the difference between multitasking, multithreading, multiprocessing, and parallel running. Now, it would be very difficult to explain all these processes in this video. So, here we are talking about executing instructions. That's multiprocessing. Multitasking is performing multiple tasks at the same time. Multithreading is where processes create their multiple threads to manage certain functions. Here, when we are parallelly executing instructions, it is known as multiprocessing. Question 2. Who mediates all access relationships between subjects and objects of a system? Now, what is a subject, what is an object, and what are access relationships? So access relationships would be your permissions that you have created. Now, what are permissions? Permissions would be something that a person is authorized to do. So if you look at the CIA, which we discussed in the module 1, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, how do we keep data confidential? By only allowing authorized users access to that data. What are authorized users? Authorized users are people who have been identified and are allowed access to certain resources. How do we do that? By having an identity and access management platform in place, which will be discussed later in the next domain. But confidentiality would include IEEE standards. IEEE starts with identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability. Identification is identifying the person, who they are. Authentication is verifying that they are actually who they claim to be. Authorization is where the access relationships come into the picture, where once we have authenticated a user, we are creating a matrix which allows them access to certain resources to a certain extent. Some may have read-only access, some may have modify access, some may have delete access, etc. So in this scenario, we are talking about access relationships between subjects and objects of a system and who mediates that. Now, when you say reference kernel, information flow model, or security kernel, or firewall, in this particular scenario, for this particular question, based on the options that are available, we are talking about a rule-based access control system, which means that we have created rules of what is allowed into a network and what is not allowed within a network. This can be controlled by using a firewall. So this can be controlled by using a firewall. Question 3. Which of the following is not a spam blocking architecture? Now, what is spam and how you're going to block it? It can be at the client side, it can be on the email server where we have identified spam filters, could be application based. In this scenario, mail blocking service is basically you creating a blacklist which will block emails from certain addresses or from certain things. So this is not a spam blocking architecture. It's basically a blacklist where you're blocking emails. But spam blocking architecture could either be at the email server based, could be at the client side where they're using, let's say, Microsoft Outlook Express and they've created rules within it, or could be on an application where you have configured rules over there. Moving on to domain 4. Now, this is where the technicalities come into the picture: communication and network security. The network security domain covers topics focused on protecting the network of an organization. So communications, TCP channels, UDP channels, the TCP IP. So you come across the OSI layer, you map the OSI layer with the TCP IP layer, and see how a data fragment packet is created. Looking at domain 4, we are talking about the OSI layer, open systems interconnection, compared to the TCP IP or the transmission control protocol over internet protocol models. We're talking about internet protocol itself. We are talking about converged protocol, software defined networks, wireless networks. Then we are talking about securing network components. So we talk about firewalls, types of firewalls, endpoint security, network access control devices, and we look at them over virtualized networks, VoIP, multimedia, talking about remote access, data communications. Right, so all of this is concerned within domain 4. Now, OSI and TCP itself could take hours for people to understand, to people to comprehend how computers work. Now, these are theoretical models, and we need to create an understanding of how theory merges with the practical world. Let's look at a few questions. What is the purpose of using a VPN? Now, the sense over here is, what is a VPN or a virtual private network? How is it created? What technologies can be utilized within it? What encryption mechanisms can be utilized? And why are we creating that encryption mechanism in the first place? So is it to secure remote access into a network, securely connect two networks together, secure data tunnel within a network, or all of the above? So here with a VPN, we are basically trying to do everything. We are trying to create encrypted tunnel between two systems or two networks where data can be transmitted in a secure manner, where man-in-the-middle attacks or network-based attacks would be mitigated. A VPN can secure packets from data link layer onwards to the application layer. Question 2. Which of the following characteristics are not included in the TCP protocol? Now, what is a TCP protocol? TCP is a connection-oriented protocol. It is a reliable protocol that is utilized to communicate between servers in a reliable manner. So a TCP protocol being a connection-oriented protocol, which is reliable in nature. So which of the following characteristics are not included? Connection-less protocol, that is the UDP protocol. So this is not included in the TCP protocol. Question 3, which, if you remember the previous slide, would be the UDP protocol. A UDP protocol is a protocol that is used for its speed rather than reliability. When it is real-time processing that is required, we use UDP. So most of our VoIP communications would happen over UDP protocols. Okay, so looking at domain number 5. Domain 5 talks about identity and access management. So this ties up with your asset management, your risk management, because if we go back to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability aspect of it, identity and access management is basically allowing authorized users access to resources by authenticating them and also holding them accountable. So this becomes the essence of how you're going to allow people to access the resources that you have in your organization. Let's look at what this domain covers. It will talk about physical and logical access to assets. So servers need to be protected by putting them in a secure server room, thus restricting access to them and allowing access only to those few people who require access to them. Once we have secured those servers, this is where we talk about physical security. Whereas we got a secure room, we are going to monitor that room. We will have access controls. We will have guards monitoring who is getting access or who's trying to get access to that environment. And then you're going to create logical access as well, where we, let's say, have swipe cards on the door locks. So anyone with logical swipe card can access that particular facility. We are also looking at managing identification and authentication of people, devices, and services. So here we are going to talk about authentication mechanisms. single authentication, multi-factor authentication. We are talking about single sign-ons. We will talk about federated identity management modules. We'll look at CASB or cloud access service brokers. We'll talk about session management from applications and so on and so forth. We will also talk about third-party identity as a service provider, where we integrate those identities like OpenID into our organization and we validate people based on the identity that they have created with those organizations. Then we talk about access control lists, which would be role-based access controls, mandatory access controls, discretionary access controls, attribute-based access controls, rule-based access controls. And then there are a lot of theoretical models that are integrated in this module, which talk about lattice-based approach, which will talk about other theoretical models which will help you align how identity and access management is implemented in an organization. So at this point in time, we will also be looking at a life cycle of how identities are managed. For example, onboarding of people, deboarding of people, termination of employees as they move within the organization by getting promotions, demotions, or changing departments and assuming a new role. So here we talk about how we can provision an identity, how we can deprovision an identity, how it is to be managed. We're going to create a relationship between the creator of this identity and the approver, who's going to be a manager. So even if somebody is allowed to create an identity, they will only create it if they have an approval from an appropriate manager. So let's look at questions from domain number 5. The first one, which of the following is the most important factor while selecting a biometric system for securing critical assets? Now here, the domain talks about the types of authentication mechanisms. There are 5 types, essentially 3 basic types, which talk about something that you know, which is a password, something that you have, a swipe card, someone that you are, a biometric, somewhere that you are, location-based, and something that you do, like CAPTCHA. So these are the 5 basic authentication types or mechanisms that you can utilize in an organization. Multi-factor authentication is having multiple of these options integrated in our identity and access management module to enhance the security. Now coming back to biometrics have positives and negatives amongst them. So with the biometric, there are 2 types that we talk about: false acceptance rate and false rejection rate. What is a false acceptance rate? Somebody, let's say you are using a thumbprint to authenticate people. Somebody put down their thumbprint. The person is not actually authorized. However, it was read incorrectly and the door got unlocked and the person got access to that particular area, which is a false acceptance rate. A false rejection rate is an authenticated or an authorized person actually trying their thumbprint, but it not getting recognized, thus they did not get access to the area or to the device that they wanted. Now the question here is, which of the following is the most important factor while selecting a biometric system for securing critical assets? Now, would I want to focus on false rejection rate or false acceptance rate? Then we also have equal error rate and maximum allowable downtime. Maximum allowable downtime is if the biometric measure fails and if nobody is getting access to any of the resources, to what level or to what extent would my business be able to tolerate such an outage? Here the correct answer is the false acceptance rate, because if an unauthorized person gets access to my devices, that's the worst case scenario. If the biometric system is down and nobody's getting access, that may still be acceptable rather than having an unauthorized person getting access to very sensitive data. False rejection rate is also detrimental to the organization. However, it is not as bad as having a false acceptance rate introduced in the organization. The second question, which are the 2 major factors to measure biometric performance? Again, the question from the previous one, FAR, false acceptance rate, and FRR, false rejection rate, or FSE and ERR, IER and FAR, FRR and GIC. They don't actually relate. So the correct answer here is FAR, false acceptance rate, and false rejection rate. So these are the 2 major factors. False rejection rate may still be a little bit acceptable, but a false acceptance rate is not tolerable at all. Next question. A commercial application for steganography that is used to identify documents or verify their authenticity is either a digital checksum, an MD5 hash, a digital signature, or a watermark. Now here the keywords matter. We are talking about steganography, so suddenly people start thinking about hiding data within data. And then if you just isolate the words identify documents or verify their authenticity, we basically directly go to a digital signature, because that's what we utilize for a non-repudiation. However, what the question refers to is an application for steganography. Steganography is hiding some element which would be visible only to known people. We can utilize steganography to benefit ourselves or our organization by using it to identify the authenticity of a document. So if I am going to print out a document, maybe a watermark on the document which is not visible to the naked eye, but when I want to validate the document, I would search for that particular watermark. And that is the correct answer for this particular question. So that's what domain 5 is all about. All right, let's look at domain number 6, which is security assessment and testing. Now, this domain is all about assessments, auditing strategies, and testing. So from this domain, what you're going to take away is talking about internal audits, external audits, third-party audits, and the security control testing, strategizing about how we implement a vulnerability management system, a program within the organization that is repeatable, consistent, and measurable, can be tied up with other management programs like patch management, incident management, and anything and everything that requires a vulnerability assessment, like even change management. If something is going to change in an organization, you can have a vulnerability assessment done before you want to even think about allowing it or disallowing that change. Similarly, with penetration testing to validate the vulnerabilities that you've identified, log reviews, having a SIEM tool that will help you analyze or create a pattern analysis of what's happening within the infrastructure, what's happening within the organization from a security perspective. Then you're talking about collecting security process data, account management. When we say account management, identity and access management life cycle. So onboarding of an employee, offboarding of an employee, the lateral movements of an employee in an organization when they're getting promoted or they are transferred in from one department to another, right? So all of these would come under security assessment and testing to see how those policies are functioning, to analyze the effectiveness of those policies, thus the requirement for conducting vulnerability assessment and penetration tests. So let's look at a few questions on this domain. And let's start off with the first one. Which of the following ways requires the involvement of an information security analyst? So out of these 4 options, a systems requirements definition, system design, program development, or program testing, during which phase would you involve a security analyst? Now for this, we first need to identify why we require a security analyst. What is the job requirement? What is the activity that is going to be conducted by a security analyst, right? So in this scenario, the correct answer is program testing. In the program development phase, we won't need an analyst. We would need a program manager and architects who can develop a particular program, who can give it some semblance of what needs to be achieved. In the system design, it would be again an architect who's going to develop that system. In the systems requirements definition, again, so in the systems requirements definition, it's a requirement gathering about what you need to adhere to, what is going to be the baseline that you're going to create. So from these 4 options, you need to identify where would you place a security analyst, right? In the exam, it's the most probable answer that you're looking for. It's not the most idealistic answer, right? So from these 4 options, security analyst would most likely be involved in the program testing phase rather than any other phase. The second question, which of the following techniques is generally not used for monitoring purposes? Now, when you say monitoring, what is monitoring? Monitoring is looking into logs, activities, anything and everything that has already happened. So you're reacting to something that has already happened. And which of these following techniques is not used for monitoring? So you're collecting logs, you're analyzing those logs, what would be not be utilized? A penetration test, intrusion detection, violation processing, or countermeasures testing, right? Now, when you're monitoring, you would monitor a penetration test to analyze if the test was successful or not. Intrusion detection, that's the first input that you look at for analysis. Violation processing, anything is violated, any processes, any policies, you analyze them and you monitor them, thus you come to know that this has happened. In countermeasures testing, this is basically a test of the effectiveness of the countermeasures that are already implemented. At that point in time, you may not be monitoring these. The software program that acts on behalf of a user in their absence to carry out operations is known as an agent, worm, applet, or a browser. So A program that acts on behalf of a user in their absence to carry out operations is either an agent, an applet, or a verb, or a browser. A browser is nothing but a software that allows you to surf the internet. A worm is a malicious application that would be more of a nuisance value than anything else. An applet is something that allows you interconnectivity. An agent is something that can be automated, used for automated tasks, and can run those tasks in the absence of a particular user. So if you look at these questions, understanding what each and every word means, understanding and highlighting the keywords in the question itself, and then analyzing the scenario that you are placed in, and then identifying the most appropriate answer for that particular question. That is how you want to approach a CISSP exam. Looking at the next domain number 7, and that's security operations. Let's look at what security operations has for us. Now, in security operations, you're looking at a SOC, a security operations center. So your regular vulnerability management, incident management, problem management, change management, placing controls, analyzing all that information. So probably having an SIEM tool, configuring the SIEM tool, collecting all those data. So identifying event sources. What are event sources? When I have an SIEM implemented, I am not going to expect the SIEM to automatically start collecting data all by itself. And then again, I don't expect the SIEM tool to understand what kind of data it needs to collect. So for me, in a security operations center, after I have installed an SIEM tool, I first need to configure it to identify which devices I want to monitor, from which devices I want to collect that information, and where do I want to store it. Once I have all that information in place, after that, I'm going to analyze that data to identify if anything has been incorrectly going on, or is there any security incident that has happened, and those will be raised as incidences, and that would be sent to the SOC team for analysis and then an incident response, right? Similarly, intrusion detection and prevention logs would be utilized to identify something that may have been missed by the IDS IPS itself. You're going to place controls for investigations, like administrative controls, which would be policies that you have made. Then you've got criminal laws, so if something bad has happened that can be described as a crime based on the law of that land, how you're going to deal with it. Civil laws, regulatory laws, and industry standards. Regulatory laws would be, for example, GDPR in the European Union, right? A civil law would be where there is no criminal activity that has happened, but let's say there's a breach of contract between two organizations and the civil lawsuit has been filed against an organization for a breach of service level agreements. Regulatory would be the GDPR Act, where you have to report to a regulatory body, and if there are any flaws, you could be fined. Industry standards, ISO 27001, PCI DSS, and so on and so forth. So when you're looking at these requirements for investigation, all of these would have prescribed how you're going to handle that investigation. If it is a criminal investigation, an organization by itself doesn't have the right to investigate. They have to go to a law enforcement agency, and there is a procedure to follow. In case of a civil lawsuit, there are lawyers who would deal with this kind of activity, send out notices to the other party, then go to a court of law to file a lawsuit over there. In GDPR, there are timelines on how you're going to report a breach or how you're going to report an incident, and so on and so forth. So in the security operations, you're creating a security operations center in alignment with all of these 5 requirements. You're going to look at logging and monitoring activities, having that SIEM tool, which will identify those devices that you want to monitor, collect relevant information that is prescribed based on all those 5 investigation types that we just discussed. Then you're looking at when you're looking at identification of assets, you go back to your asset inventory, asset register, you look at all the assets that you have, and then you make your strategy and plan how you want to collect those logs, right? And then this module will deal about how do you want to handle identity and access management, privilege account management, service level agreements, and so on and so forth. So this basically is the day-to-day business activity of an organization from a security perspective. So you are there to identify incidents. As a CISSP, you won't be executing this, but you would be creating policies revolving all of these aspects. So this is what you need to consider. This is what you need to strategize upon. And this is what you want to advise the organization, what needs to be in place to be more effective from a security perspective. Let's look at the few questions from this domain. How does a subject get access to an object in a multi-level security policy? Now, first we need to understand what a multi-level security policy is. We need to understand what a subject is and what an object is. Let's look at the options first. The subject sensitivity label must dominate the object sensitivity label. The subject sensitivity label subordinates the object sensitivity label. The subject sensitivity label is subordinated by the object sensitivity label. And to repeat the sensitivity tags again and again, the subject sensitivity label is dominated by the object sensitivity label. Too much sensitivity in a single slide. However, you can see that this just confuses the person of what they're trying to read. Not only you missing what keywords are, so people normally focus on a keyword called multi-level security policy and start getting confused in that, while we do disregard what a subject and an object is. Right? So a subject and an object is a relationship that is created between identity and access management, subject being the user, object being the resource that needs to be accessed by that particular user. After which comes a multi-level security policy, which is basically the access control matrix that you have created between these multiple objects and multiple subjects. So, for example, in this domain, you would also talk about theoretical models for access management, including lattice-based approach, where the sensitivity labels come into the picture. You would talk about Clark-Wilson model, you will talk about Bell-LaPadula model, and a few other models, right? All of them theoretical in nature, which can then, based on other implementations, be implemented in a real-time scenario. So all that understanding comes into the picture, and then you need to identify how those sensitivity labels in a lattice-based approach could allow you to create those labels for your subjects and objects, and then the identity and access management tool would become the verification factor where it identifies the labels for the subject and the object, and based on those labels they allow or disallow connectivity or allow connections to happen. Now here the correct answer is that the subject sensitivity label must dominate the object's sensitivity label. So the user should have a sensitivity label that allows them access to the object which has an equivalent sensitivity label. So understanding those models becomes very much important, not only from an exams perspective, but when you're creating a policy, you basically are going to use these terminologies and you're going to create a policy around this. Moving on, the second question, managers of which department are ideal for the development of information security policy for an organization? Business operation, information technology, purchase, or human resources? Now, managers of which department are ideal for development of information security policy for an organization? And when we say information security policy, we would obviously assume that is the IT department who's going to deal with it, and it's the information technology in this case. But that's incorrect. It is the business operation. Why? Because right from the first domain, so we would be taught in the training for CISSP that security needs to enhance the business functionality, not the other way around. So we are in the business, or we are in the function of conducting a business which would offer services, and those services that are being offered, the business activity that has been conducted, should be supplemented by security, so those business activities could be conducted in a secure manner. At no point in time is security going to be a deterrent to business. The only reason for anything to become a deterrent to business is the legality of it. If a business is illegal, it will not happen, or it should not happen. However, if the business activity is legal, then security should not stop that activity from happening. Security should be implemented in such a way that the business activity is strengthened. There is security embedded within it, secure by design, and then the business activity goes on. So even if you're a chief information security officer or a security manager, and you go and talk with the board of directors or the steering committee, as the terms you will come across in this training, you will understand that it's these people who would define how the business is going to work, what kind of business activity you're going to do, and then you provide the example. And I'll give you an example here. Let's say I'm an online retailer and I want to sell goods online, which is legal. I'm selling all legal goods. Now I want security team to come in, and they would help me to secure the function of being an online e-tailer, if you will. My security team is not going to come and tell me of not to go into that business or stop some services because they may be insecure, right? The security team's requirement is that if I want to sell goods online, they need to now create an architecture of devices, of clouds, of whatever is required to make it secure. So thus, The managers of business operations will always be the ideal department for the development of information security policies. They decide what the business is going to happen, and then the security team just complements it by adding the security to it. For example, just going on with this, a website is launched with HTTP. The security team comes into the picture and says data in motion needs security, so we're going to convert it into HTTPS. And at no point in time are they going to say HTTP is vulnerable, so we are not going to do this. We'd rather become a wholesale shop or something like that. And I'm just giving an example. And rather than me just rambling on, let's move on to the next question. Question 3, installing malicious software on the system to allow future backdoor access leads to violation of what integrity? Does it violate the data integrity, system, user, or network? Now, malicious software on a system to allow future backdoor access. So what are we doing here? We are basically installing a software or an application on a particular system which allows a hacker a backdoor access to the system. So this would violate the integrity of the system itself, right? The data would be compromised, but the data would be compromised because the system got compromised. A user doesn't matter because a backdoor is a backdoor entry where you can get access without even logging in as a user. And a network is just a way of communication at this point in time, but the essence being that system got infected, and through that infection, you got access to whatever was on that particular system. Now, that's domain number 7. Domain number 8, which is the last domain in the CISSP exam, is software development security, SDLC or SSDLC, Secure Software Development Life Cycle, right? That's what is discussed in this domain. Let's go back to the CISSP guide and see what this domain would consist of. So, software development security. Now you can see software development life cycles coming in. So they're going to talk about different life cycles like waterfall model. They're going to talk about agile. They're going to talk about modified waterfall. This module also will talk about DevSecOps, DevOps, and anything and everything that would be there with the software development life cycle. Now, when we say software development life cycle, the essence of a CISSP is to add another S to the SDLC. The SDLC stands for Software Development Lifecycle. The CISSP adds one more S, the Secure Software Development Lifecycle. So, as with everything, secure by design, which means security needs to be integrated at every phase of the life cycle, and it should not be bolted on. For example, a waterfall model talks about how the software is going to be developed and how it is going to be published or released at the end of the life cycle. At no point in time does it talk about security. Thus, security architect at that point in time would come into the picture and decide what are the requirements of the software, what are the security vulnerabilities or the risks that they see. So threat modeling would happen, and all those things need to be introduced right from the inception. So if there are developers or if there is a business requirement for an application, let's go back to the previous example. I'm an e-tailer. So to become an e-tailer, not do I only need a website. I will need a web application for that functionality to be given out. So I need to develop that application. In a regular lifecycle model, I develop that application and then go into security where I do a VAPT on that application, find out that there are disastrous results, and then I go back and start coding again, which is not a good scenario. So I have hired a CISSP who will then come into the picture during the SDLC and at the inception itself when businessmen are talking about how the business is going to happen. At that point in time, the CISSP will come in and start with a threat modeling exercise saying, you know what, let's talk about what are the risks this application is going to face. You're going to handle a lot of payment information because people need to pay for the products, right? So credit cards, you're going to be involved. There's a database, so SQL injection attacks. So these are the threats that we are looking at. And now a threat modeling exercise would be followed by a risk assessment. Then would be looked at by an impact analysis. And then based on that, you will prioritize those risks. You will then educate your developers to use secure coding practices. At the same time, security testing would be done to see how the application is being evolved. And then by the time that the software development lifecycle comes to an end, you would have a secure software which had security by design integrated since the inception rather than having bolted on. Now, this is the ideal scenario that you're looking for. The expense and the budgeting, that's where the balance of capital investments and time to market and all that comes into the picture. But for the training, we will always be in an ideal scenario. We'll always have enough time, enough resources, monetary and human. And the exam basically looks at a very ideal scenario in which you got just about everything. You just need to make the correct decision. At no point in time are you going to think that if I start doing a particular strategy, it is going to cost me a lot of money, so I don't want to do that. That's the real world scenario. In the real world, you look at the costs, you look at the timelines, deadlines, and then you take a informed decision of how much you want to invest in what. In the ideal world, for the CISSP exam or the CISSP exam, there are no limitations. You are looking at the most correct way of doing those things, and thus you identify those requirements, and that's how you answer the exam. So you're looking at the security software environments that you require, configuration management, auditing and logging of changes, security impact of acquired software. Now, in this scenario, we talked about developing a software. What if I purchase a third-party software and I introduce it into my organization? Now, this software, when integrated, how is it going to impact my current security controls, impact my current identity access management, my networking, my other applications, my communications? So that's something that you want to assess as well, right? So let's go for the questions. Question 1, in which of the following RAID level the drive array continues to operate even if any disk fails? Now, in the actual exam, they are not going to be very technical. It's a managerial exam, so they may not ask you these kind of questions, but the knowledge is still required. So you need to know that there is something called RAID, the different levels of RAID, because you might want to use that as a solution in a particular thing. How do you want to implement RAID and all of those? That's not the knowledge that we want. But in this scenario, RAID level 7 is the ideal answer. Question 2, which of the following steps can be utilized or can be used to protect an organization against the failure of a critical software firm? Now, basically, what does this talk about? This talks about disaster recovery, or this talks about business continuity. For example, there's a failure of some sort. When there is something that fails, what does it do? It interrupts the business. So the moment a business interruption happens, what should kick in? The business continuity plan. If the business continuity plan fails, then the disaster recovery plan kicks in. So if you look into it, as we go in, we might even come against terminologies like RTOs, RPOs, return time objective, and recovery point objective. And at that point in time, you want to look at how do we want to recover from a data loss. And thus, you will come across solutions. Now, of the 4 options, full backups, differential backups, and incremental backups. And the 4th one, software escrow agreement. What is the difference between these? A full backup is a complete backup of the entire data that you have taken. Now, it sounds easy, but in an organization, data could be terabytes, petabytes, and to do a complete backup might take days, weeks, or a lot of time, right? It's not just copying 1 megabyte from a hard disk to a USB drive and be done with the backup. So full backups may be possible, but not on a regular basis. So maybe you do a full backup every week, which means that at the end of the week, if the data loss happens, then you have lost the data for an entire week because the backup was last week. Thus, it's not a very good solution. And to complement that, we could use incremental backups and differential backups, right? So the training would include all of these definitions of what these backups are, what happens. And then the 4th option, software escrow agreement. What is that? Now, in a software development or a software lifecycle, if I've purchased a software from a third party, my biggest risk is not of me getting hacked or the software getting hacked. From a business continuity, the biggest risk is if the software provider goes bankrupt or is taken over by somebody else or stops supporting the software, then what? What am I to do? Because I may have invested millions of dollars, or reinvesting into a different product and migrating to a different product would be expensive, very costly, and may be very time consuming. So what do I do at that point in time? So there is an option for software escrow agreement. What does that mean? That the source code of that software is placed in an escrow, which means, let's say in a bank, where the bank will hold the source code in a secure manner, and the source code cannot be accessed or be modified either by the developing organization or the purchasing organization. So it just sits with the bank. If the developers go out of business or they stop supporting, at that point in time, the escrow can be opened and the purchaser, that's us in this case, can still get the source code. So now we can develop the software, or we can go into the source code, analyze, and save ourselves from a disaster, right? So these are the 4 options. Now here you're talking about a critical software firm that failed. You're not talking about data that failed. So the correct answer here is the software escrow agreement, right? Question number 3. Now here we come across the word development models. Which one of these is a meta model that incorporates several other software development models? Are we looking at waterfall, modified waterfall, spiral, or critical patch? Here the correct answer is a waterfall model.
And with that, we have come to the end of this video on CISSP training. I hope it was informative and interesting. If you have any questions related to the topics that were covered in this video, please ask away in the comment section below. Our team will help you solve your queries. Thanks for watching, stay safe and keep learning.
Hi there, if you like this video, subscribe to the Simplilearn YouTube channel and click here to watch similar videos. To nerd up and get certified, click here.